Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. Today I'll be speaking with Peter Singer. Peter is certainly one of the most famous living philosophers, and he's been very influential on public morality, both with respect to the treatment of animals and in this growing movement that I spoke about with Will MacAskill on a previous podcast, known as effective altruism. He's a professor of bioethics at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton. He's the author of many books, including Animal Liberation, which is often considered the silent spring of the animal rights movement. He's also written The Life You Can Save and The Most Good You Can Do and The Ethics of What We Eat and many other books. His most recent book is Ethics in the Real World, 82 Brief Essays on Things That Matter, and I highly recommend it. Peter and I talk about many things, and we ran out of time, frankly. We had 2 hours booked, and as you'll hear at the end, I come up against the brick wall of time constraint and really was wanting to talk about many more things, so I'll have to bring Peter back at some point. We spend the first half hour or so talking about how it's possible to talk about moral truth, and if that's not to your taste, if you're not really worried about how we can ground our morality in universal truth claims, you might skip 30 minutes in or so where we start talking about questions of practical ethics, and we touch many things: the ethics of violence, politics, free speech, euthanasia. There's just a lot we cover, and I hope you find it useful. And if you do find conversations like this useful, you can once again support the podcast at samharris.org/support. And as always, your support is greatly appreciated, and it's what allows me to clear my schedule to do this sort of thing and keeps this all ad-free. And now I bring you Peter Singer. So I have Peter Singer on the line. Peter, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Sam, for having me on the podcast. It's good to be talking with you.
Listen, everyone will know who you are, but perhaps you can briefly describe what you do at this point and the kinds of questions you focus on.
Sure. I'm a professor of bioethics at Princeton University, and I also have a regular visiting position at the University of Melbourne in Australia, which is where I'm originally from. I work in ethics. I've been interested in a range of different issues. I wrote a book called Animal Liberation, published back in 1975, that some regard as having started off the modern animal rights movement. I've also been interested for many years in the obligations of the affluent, people like us, to people in extreme poverty elsewhere in the world. And I've written on issues in bioethics, questions about the sanctity of life, and a range of other questions that come up in that field.
Yeah, and your new book is entitled Ethics in the Real World, and I'll have a link to it on my blog, and I certainly encourage listeners to get that. It's great because it's divided into these 82 very short chapters, literally like 3-page essays on philosophical questions, and again, emphasis is on the real world here. So you tackle questions like, should poor people be able to sell their organs? Is it more ethical to eat fish than cows? Should Holocaust denial be a crime? These are all questions where public policy and how people actually live their lives are just explicitly in play, and just super digestible philosophical essays. So I recommend people get that. If I'm not mistaken, Peter, you and I have only met once, right? I think it was at this Arizona event organized by Lawrence Krauss, which was...
That's right. Yes, that's the only time we've actually met in person.
Yeah, which unfortunately it was titled The Great Debate, somewhat pretentiously perhaps, but it was you and me and Steve Pinker and Lawrence and Patricia Churchland, I think, and a few other people, and that's available for people to see on YouTube. If I recall correctly, you and I got somewhat bogged down disagreeing about the foundations of morality and human values, but I had the sense at the time that we were talking past one another and getting derailed on semantics more than anything else. So I'd like us to start with the topic of the foundations of morality and to answer the question, or attempt to answer the question, how is it possible for something to be right and wrong in this universe, or good and bad, and then move from there into what is the relationship between the claims we make about good and evil and right and wrong and facts of the sort that fall within the purview of science. And then once we have just a concept of goodness in hand and how it relates to truth claims, then I want to go on to talk about just the practical reality of doing good in the world. And this will lead to questions of effective altruism and population ethics and moral illusions and all the rest. So this first question I put to you is how is it that you think about moral truth? Does moral truth exist? And if it does, what is the relationship between the true claims we make about good and evil, or right and wrong, and facts of the sort we talk about in science?
Right. That's a good question and a very large question. It's one that I've grappled with on and off for most of my philosophical career. And I have changed my views on it significantly in the last few years. So earlier on in my career, I would have said that there are no objective truths in ethics, but we can prescribe that certain things be done, and we can prescribe them not just for ourselves or out of our own interest, but we can prescribe them in a way that is, to use a term that my former Oxford supervisor, Professor R.M. Hare, coined, universalizable. That doesn't mean that they're the same for everyone, but what it means is that I can express them without referring to myself or without using terms like I or proper names. So, for example, if I were to say, as Donald Trump has recently been saying, it's fine for me not to pay any taxes, then I would have to say it's fine for anyone in my situation not to pay taxes. And of course, one might not be so keen to do that. You can think of other circumstances in which people might say even worse things. The Nazi might say, it's good for me to kill Jews. But then we can ask the Nazi to imagine, well, suppose you suddenly discovered actually that you're of Jewish ancestry, or your parents had hidden this from you. Does that mean that it's fine for any Nazi to kill you? Most Nazis probably would think twice. There might be a few ideological fanatics who would still say yes, but most people wouldn't. So that was as far as I thought you could go, really, that it did depend on people's inclinations and prescriptions, and there was no objective truth in it. But I now think that that's not correct. I think that there are some claims which you can say are truths, that they're things that we can reflect on and that strike us as simply undeniable, if you like, as self-evident, although that's not to say that everybody will immediately agree with them. But an example would be that inflicting agony for no real purpose, let's say inflicting agony on someone else because it brings you some kind of moderate enjoyment, mild enjoyment, that's wrong. And what's really at work here is the idea that agony is something that's a bad thing, that the world is a better place if there's less agony in it. And I do think that that's a very hard claim to deny. That the fact that someone is in agony provides anyone really with a reason to try to alleviate that agony or to stop it. And the fact that doing an action will cause someone to be in agony is a reason not to do it. Not necessarily an overriding reason, but it is a reason against doing it.
But now, so you say your views here changed recently. Well, I guess how recently? Are we talking since I saw you in Arizona, or before that?
Probably when I saw you in Arizona, I was to some extent in transition. And it's been a sort of slow transition. I was always trying, even maybe 30 years ago, I was trying to find ways in which you could tighten up the arguments, that you could bring in some role for reason in this, so that the problem with the position that my mentor R.M. Hare had developed was that he said that universalizability just depended on the concept of ought, the basic moral concept, ought, good, and right, incorporated this idea of universalizability. And the problem with that was that if somebody said, okay, so I'm just not going to use those words, right? Instead of saying you ought to do something, I'll say you schmort do something, or, that's schmight. I'm just going to invent my own concepts. And now it's fine for me to not pay any taxes. And I don't have to say that anybody else in my position, also doesn't have to pay taxes or any of these other implications. And that just didn't seem good enough. That seemed too easy a way out of moral arguments. So I was always looking for something a bit stronger and looking at whether you could argue that there was a rational requirement that was corresponding to this universalizability. And so I guess I only wrote about this in a book called The Point of View of the Universe, which is a co-authored book with a Polish philosopher, Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek, came out in 2014. So it's perhaps a year or two before that. In thinking about that book, I had already come to the conclusion that you can argue that there are some things that are moral truths or self-evident. The 19th century philosopher Henry Sidgwick, who we discuss in that book, describes them as moral axioms.
Mm.
Yeah, so it's within the last, let's say, 5 years, definitely, that I've come to this position.
So, if I'm not mistaken, this is anchored in a kind of consequentialism or utilitarianism. So, what do you do with the claim that consequentialism is itself just an expression of a mere preference and is unjustifiable?
Well, I don't think that that's correct. I think that there are different forms of consequentialism. What they have in common, of course, is the view that what we ought to do is the act that will have the best consequences, and then the discussion is what do we mean by best consequences.
Mm.
But I think that that's right. I think that when you think about uh, different actions, if it's clear that one act will have better consequences, all things considered, than any outcome, I'd be prepared to say that it's then true that that act is the right thing to do.
Mm.
Now, obviously, that can be denied by people who think that there are some moral rules which we ought never to break, no matter what the consequences. That's not a view that I accept. I would try to argue that my view is true, but that really has to be, at least in part, by undermining the foundations of the alternative view. It's not so self-evident that the consequentialist view is right that one can just state it and everybody will see it to be right, because partly because there've been a whole history and culture of moral thinking which is based on rules. Moral rules do have a certain social purpose. They're useful. They simplify decisions. We can't calculate from first principles every time we act which act will have the best consequences.
Mm.
So it's not all that surprising that people sometimes think that these rules have a kind of inherent objectivity of their own, and that we should obey them no matter what the consequences. But that's the kind of argument you need to have.
I think we largely agree here. I'm tempted to not spend a lot of time fishing around for areas where we might disagree in metaethics, but I think most of the listeners to this podcast will be familiar with my views on morality and moral realism, as I lay out in my book, The Moral Landscape. I guess just a couple of points I would make here. I think whenever I hear someone say that they are not a consequentialist, whether they hold to some rule that they think is important regardless of consequences, what I believe I have found without exception in those conversations and in reading the work of people like Kant and other famous non-consequentialists is that they smuggle in consequences into the primacy of the rule. That if the rule had bad consequences, it would never suggest itself as a reliable basis for ethics. So if Kant's categorical imperative reliably produced needless human misery that was otherwise avoidable, no one would think that the categorical imperative was a good idea, right? And so if you drill down on why people are attached to a rule, you tend to get justifications for it, which have to be cashed out in the form of consequences, whether they're actual or potential. Has that been your experience, or do you see it differently?
I certainly think that the tendency of most of the rules that are part of everyday morality is to produce better consequences. I think you're right about that, and I think you're probably right that any rule that reliably produced more misery would be dropped, and a different rule would be substituted. But of course, what does often happen, and Kant is a good instance of this, is that you have a rule that generally has good consequences, like the rule that you should tell the truth, and then somebody imagines a situation where a would-be murderer comes to your house and asks if you have seen so and so, and it so happens that so and so knows that this guy is pursuing him and has asked if you will hide him in your basement. Now, most of us would, of course, say, well, it is justified to lie in those circumstances, but Kant actually sticks to the rule and says,
Mm.
no, it's wrong to lie even then. So part of the problem with the people who are not consequentialist, or some of them at least, is they want to stick to their rules no matter what, even if the general tendency of the rule is to have good consequences. And so I would describe that as a rule that we should apply in everyday life, but not as a rule we should stick to no matter what.
The other thing here, which gives us this sense, or gives many people the sense that there can't be such a thing as moral truth, is we value differences of opinion in philosophy, and in particular moral philosophy, in a way that we don't in the rest of our truth claiming about the world. So if someone comes to the table saying that they have a very different idea about how to treat women, we should make them live in bags, as the Taliban do, and this is how we want to live, and there's no place to stand where you can tell me that I'm wrong because I'm just being guided by my age-old moral code, for which I even have a religious justification. Many people in the West, I think largely as a result of what postmodernism has done to the humanities, but perhaps there are other reasons, imagine that there's just no place to stand where you can contradict that opinion or dismiss it. You can't actually say, well, some people are not adequate to the conversation for reasons that should be obvious. And yet we do this in science and everywhere else. I mean, just in journalism or in history, in any place where people are purporting to make claims that are true, when someone shows up and demands that their conspiracy theories about alien abductions or whatever it is, get taken seriously, we just say, "Well, sorry, these views are so uninteresting and so obviously incredible that they don't actually constitute any kind of rejoinder to what is being said here." And so it's very easy to disregard them. Now, occasionally some outline view becomes credible for some reason, and then it subverts what we think is true, and that's just a process of criticism that just has to run its course. But I feel like in moral philosophy, many people have just tied their hands and imagine that everyone gets a vote in moral epistemology, and it's an equal vote. And so, there's just, what Derek Parfit thinks about morality doesn't matter any more than what Mullah Omar thinks, and everyone is on all fours in their truth claims. And I think that's been very destabilizing for many people in the West when it comes time to talk about the nature of human values and how we can talk about them in universal terms. Just the fact that you can still meet anthropologists, and it might even be still a majority of anthropologists who doubt whether a universal notion of human values is even a credible thing to aspire to.
Yeah, I mean, anthropologists seem particularly prone to that. Maybe it's going to occupational hazard of studying a lot of different societies.
Mm.
And of course, you do find different particular practices in different societies, but you also find some common tendencies. For example, reciprocity is pretty much a universal value. It's very hard to find a society in which it's not considered a good thing to do favors to those who've done favors to you, and conversely, that you're entitled to have some kind of retribution on those who've done bad things to you. But that's, of course, not to say that this is actually the right morality. This is just to say that this is kind of the evolved morality of our species, and indeed not just of our species, but of long-lived social primates who recognize each other as individuals. Um, but I wanted to get back to the larger point that you were making. And I don't quite see as much reluctance to criticize ethical views of different cultures as you described. I think most people, for example, who are not uh, of that religious group, and it's not all Islam, but it's a particular part of Islam,
Mm.
who think that women should not go out in public without, as you put it, wearing a bag over themselves. Um, I think most people who are not of that religious group would be prepared to say that that's wrong. That it's wrong to treat women in that way. It's wrong to deny them privileges that men automatically have, and they would reject as unethical that way of treating women. Now, what does come over the top of this is that we have, I think you and I would agree, perhaps excessive respect for religion. And I think that comes out of a long tradition of people fighting over religion and often killing over religion. And at some point, perhaps around the 17th and 18th centuries, people started to say, well, enough of this. I'll leave you alone to practice your religion, and you leave me alone to practice my religion, and then we don't have to kill each other over it. And of course, in some sense, that's a very good idea, that we don't have to kill each other over it. But it can be taken too far. It can be taken to the point of, well, you know, every religion is sort of somehow good in itself, or beyond criticism in itself. And I think that that's completely wrong. But if somebody tried to put it forward as a sort of a secular belief that women should cover themselves completely whenever they go out in public, whereas men are perfectly free to display their arms and legs and so on, and of course face, uh, I think people would be pretty baffled by that view. And I don't think that they would think, oh, yeah, that's fine.
Well, you haven't spent as much time criticizing these views as I have, I think, in public. I would agree that most people feel that there's something wrong there, but I've noticed that the more educated you become, certainly in the humanity, actually not just the humanities, it's science as well. Hume's "you can't derive an ought from an is" has become this shibboleth among very educated but incompletely educated people, and
Well, I'm going to disagree with you about that, because I think that's true. That's a philosophical claim that I think is defensible.
I think it's defensible within a certain construal. Yeah, we can talk about that. But I know physicists who will say, I don't like slavery. I personally would vote against it. I would put my shoulder to the wheel in resisting it. But I have no illusion that in resisting slavery, I am making any claim about what is true. There's just no place to stand in science to make those claims with respect to morality. And so what that does is that divorces morality from any conception of the well-being of conscious creatures like ourselves, and it's claiming that no matter how far advanced we become in understanding well-being and the possible experiences that suitable minds can have, we will never know anything about what is better or worse in this universe. I mean, but so my view, again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because there's so much in applied ethics that I want to talk to you about, but I do want to hear your pushback on the ought and is issue.
Yeah.
But I just, my claim here is that, I mean, we could forget about ought, as you suggested earlier, though I take that in a very different direction. I mean, just imagine we have no conception of ought and we have no conception of morality, but we we appear in a universe where certain experiences are possible. So I view morality as a kind of navigation problem. We are conscious systems, and there is a possibility to experience unendurable and pointless misery for as long as possible. And then there are all these other possibilities. And my view is that anything is better than the worst possible misery for everyone.
Look, I totally agree with you about that moral judgment. And I also agree with you that understanding well-being, what causes brings about well-being, what reduces suffering, how our minds work, all of that is highly relevant for deciding what we ought to do.
Hmm.
But and so I think, and I also think that the physicist that you mentioned is wrong if he says my judgment that happiness is better than misery, let's say, is is not true. I don't think that I can say that this is true. I think you can say that it's true, but I don't think it actually follows from the description of the natural universe. I think it follows only if you make that judgment, and I think you actually made it. You used the word better, that it's better if there's a world in which there's, people are living rich, enjoyable, fulfilling lives than if they're miserable, suffering, and so on. But we have to say, well, what is that judgment that it's better? I think it's a judgment that we use our reason
Hmm.
to get at. So I think that we have normative reasons, even if we didn't use the word ought, even if we decided that the institution of morality is not one that we want to be part of. I think we'd have to say, do we have reasons for acting to bring about the happy world that you described rather than the miserable world that you described? And I would answer, yes, we definitely do have reasons for acting because it's a better world. But I wouldn't claim that I can deduce that reason for acting simply from the description of here's one world and here's the other. There has to be, it's not just a description. There has to be, as I say, something normative, by which I mean reasons that ought to move a rational being towards choosing one world rather than the other.
Right. Well, I would fully agree with that, except the reason why the is-ought dichotomy is uninteresting to me is you can't get to any description of what is without obeying certain oughts in the first place. I mean, so you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps at some point. And so, logical intuitions are not self-justifying. We just grab them and use them. And, a desire for evidence. Why should you desire evidence? What evidence are you going to provide to convince someone that they should desire evidence if they don't desire evidence for their truth claims? Or, what logical argument will you use to prove to someone that they should value logic if they don't value logic? I mean, these are brute facts of epistemology, which we use without any apology, really, because we can do no other. I would just say that valuing any movement away from the worst possible misery for everyone, right? I mean, so again, just, I want our listeners to absorb what those words mean. Imagine a universe where everything that can suffer suffers for as long as it possibly can, as deeply as it can, and no good comes of it, right? There's no silver lining to this. This is a perfect hell for all conscious creatures. That's bad, if the word bad is going to mean anything. And getting out of that situation is good and is something you should do if words like good and should mean anything. And that, in my view, that's all we need to get this consequentialist machine
Okay,
turning.
okay. I don't think we're disagreeing on anything very significant here. Perhaps we're disagreeing on whether these are facts that science describes or whether they're reasons that are part of what it is to have reasons for action.
Yeah, I don't think we disagree there because, I mean, the point of confusion that I think you and I got bogged down by the first time around was in a very different definition of the word science. I mean, I was always using science in a much more elastic sense to coincide much more with the way you're using the word reason. And so I'm not just
Right.
talking about people in white lab coats who can run experiments immediately on any given hypothesis or ever. I mean, so there are truth claims we want to make or could make about the world, which we know we would never test scientifically, but we know there are facts of the matter, and the fact that we can't get the data in hand doesn't make the truth or falsity of those claims any less assured. So, I mean, again, the one I use all the time, and I might have even used it with you in Arizona, was, what was JFK thinking the moment he got shot? Well, there's an infinite number of things I know he wasn't thinking. I know he wasn't thinking, I wonder what Peter Singer and Sam Harris are going to say about what I was thinking. And the list can just grow from there. And that's a claim about his inner life, of what it was like to be him, that is ontologically subjective, right? I'm making a claim about his subjectivity and on some level the state of his brain, but it's epistemologically objective in that which is to say it's true. It's just there's every reason to believe it. And people doubt that you can make claims about human subjectivity that are, wherever you stand, surviving all of the tests of credibility that claims about physics and chemistry need to survive. And I mean, that's my particular hobby horse, that people feel that this area is just by definition less clear, less truthful, less grounded in the kinds of cognition we use to do science. But again, I just think there's nothing more sure than some of these claims we could make about morality once we look at the intuitions we're using to make the claims. The intuition that 2 plus 2 makes 4, and that this abstraction is generalizable. So it works for apples, it works for oranges, it works for boats. That intuition that is at the foundation of arithmetic, again, is just something we apes are doing with our minds, and it works. But I just think it's not in a different sphere from the kinds of intuitions you and I are talking about with respect to it is good to reduce pointless agony, all things considered.
Yeah, we're certainly agreed on that, and I think we're agreed on rejecting the various forms of subjectivism and relativism that the postmodernist ideas in particular have encouraged some people to have. I find that quite disappointing in a way. You get people who come out of backgrounds where they're doing cultural studies, and they come up with the same sort of views that freshmen come up to Princeton with, and we discuss in early seminars. And they usually fairly rapidly see that those views aren't really tenable, that they have implications that they don't want to accept. But there are certainly more sophisticated forms of that kind of relativism and subjectivism that are still around, and I think we're agreed that ethics is a field in which there are truths. Exactly, how we classify those truths is a fine point, but I
Hmm.
think probably it needn't really delay us any longer. I think we've clarified where we are.
Okay, so let's move forward with that consensus in hand. So we want to reduce suffering, all things considered, and maximize the well-being of conscious creatures. And we don't need to waste much time justifying that going forward. So now, what do you do in a situation where people claim that suffering is being produced, but you feel, and suffering is in fact being produced, but you feel that the basis for the suffering is illegitimate. Let's say it's based on a religious dogma. So the example that comes to mind now is the cartoon controversy. What if a consequentialist, philosophically minded but still doctrinaire panel of Muslim philosophers came to you and said, "Listen, whenever you cartoon the prophet or tolerate others cartooning the prophet, you produce a tremendous amount of suffering in millions of devout Muslims, suffering that you can't compensate us for, suffering that we are committed to feeling based on our beliefs, and therefore it is just wrong to do this, and you need to conform your freedom of speech to our religious sensitivities." How do you think about that?
I do think about that in terms of the consequences of the action. So I'm not somebody who's going to say, no, I have a right to free speech, and if I choose to exercise that right to free speech, I will do so no matter what the consequences. The question to be considered is what are the consequences of restraining free speech in this area? And there's no doubt, I think, that these cartoons are offensive to Muslims, and they will cause some hurt feelings. Um, Perhaps more serious than that, because people can get over their hurt feelings. I'd say more serious is the fact that some of them may then uh, engage in protests that turn violent, may attack Christians if there are Christians or let's say, people they consider to be infidels, not necessarily Christians, but not Muslims anyway.
Mm.
If they're living in their country, may attack and kill them. These things have happened. And I think that that's something that anybody thinking of publishing these cartoons needs to give very significant weight to. On the other side, I think that religious intolerance is a major source of suffering in the world. And of course, in the case of militant Islamic views, we've seen very clearly in recent years how that can cause specific violent attacks, which clearly cause a lot of suffering on the people who are killed or injured, and the families and relatives, and so on. So the question is, do we want to just accept that those religious beliefs cannot be criticized, and that therefore they will continue forever or indefinitely? I guess nothing lasts forever. Or do we want to see whether we can, in some ways, encourage fewer people to hold those beliefs, or at least encourage people to hold them in a more open, tolerant form? And then, of course, and I think the answer to that is yes. I do think that we should be free to criticize religious beliefs, especially those that do a great deal of harm. And then the further question is the use of ridicule an effective means of achieving that end? And on that one, I'm not so sure. So, in other words, if it were a question of publishing arguments against the claims made by in Islam, publishing historical studies about how the Quran came to be written, and publishing studies of the Quran showing contradictions or inconsistencies, which of course exist in the Bible and in any of these substantial texts from long ago, going to be demonstrably inaccurate in some places. So is that the way we want to try to persuade people to shift their religious beliefs, or should we try actually ridiculing those beliefs? And my guess is that probably both have some effect, but I'm not sufficiently convinced at the moment that that ridicule is so much more effective as to outweigh the serious consequences that it can have.
Yeah, I guess my intuition here is that the rule of privileging free speech over everything else is just so useful that the need to rethink it in any local case is almost never pressing. I think free speech being essentially the equivalent of, sunlight spread on bad ideas, it's such a reliable mechanism for bringing bad ideas to light, criticizing them, getting others to react to them, that the moment you begin to look for local instances where you need to calculate the harm done by exercising it, I think it's almost always counterproductive. I mean, for instance, is one area here where I know you and I agree because I've read what you wrote in your most recent book, but the idea that Holocaust denial should be illegal, right? Because of all the harm it does both to the survivors and their descendants, and also just the fact that it seems to encourage, or at least is imagined to encourage, the survival of these noxious views, Nazism and neo-Nazism in Europe. You and I both agree that it shouldn't be illegal and that you shouldn't put people in prison for denying the Holocaust, that the appropriate response there is ridicule and the attendant destruction of their reputation, and just talking more about the evidence for the Holocaust, and just the normal process whereby we expose bad ideas to criticism and use the immune system of conversation to deal with them.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly agree about that example. And I think that the way to deal with Holocaust denial is to simply show the evidence that the Holocaust existed, and that evidence is totally overwhelming. Whereas locking somebody up who denies the existence of the Holocaust probably just encourages conspiracy theorists to think, oh, well, if they have to prohibit people denying it, that must be because there isn't really good evidence that it happened. So that's a case where we're completely in agreement. But I'm not sure that, if you're saying there is no case where a restriction of freedom of speech is justified, then I disagree. And I disagree with the kind of case that John Stuart Mill, who, of course, is a famous defender of freedom of thought and expression, in his book on liberty, carved out an exception
Mm.
where he said that, in his day, corn dealers were very unpopular. It was thought that they were hoarding corn, profiteering from it, and starving the poor. So um, he gave the example of somebody who, standing in front of the house of a corn dealer, addresses an excited mob saying that corn dealers are starving the poor or robbing the poor or something of that sort. And he thought it was legitimate to prevent that speech taking place. On the other hand, he said if in different circumstances somebody wants to hand out a leaflet expressing exactly the same views, but not in front of the house of a corn dealer and in front of an excited mob, then that was perfectly legitimate. And there was a right to freedom of thought and expression that extended to expressing that opinion. Now, of course, times have changed somewhat, and we have instant communication anywhere. And so the case of the cartoons, which are then we know going to get spread over the internet and read about or reported in uh, countries where there is a lot of militant Islamic thought, um, may have a similar effect in terms of inciting a mob to attack and kill, as I say, the people they regard as infidels, or representatives of the government where the cartoons are published, or whoever it might be. So that's why I'm not sure that the exceptions ought not to extend here. Not that I really want to see a law against those cartoons. That might be a step too far and might be difficult to say exactly what is legitimate uh, ridicule or satire and acceptable. But I think if I were an editor and I were aware that of what the consequences were going to be, if I, let's say, had reliable evidence that they would cause the death of hundreds of innocent people,
Mm.
I would choose not to publish those cartoons.
I would agree that if you are going to make the causality absolutely clear and say, well, somebody is going to die if you publish this cartoon, we know that, well, then that it becomes difficult to justify publishing it. But then we're always dealing in probabilities. And if the probability is high enough, as it probably is in this case, you could reasonably expect that people will riot and someone will get injured or killed as a result. But the thing is, where it puts us in a position where a whole civilization, whole societies can be held hostage to the whims of, in this case, religious maniacs. But I'm by no means just focusing on the specific case of Islam. It's just anyone could announce Unabomber style, if you say X or you don't say X, I'm going to kill someone. And there's just something so corrosive about that, and it can be so consciously and cynically used against us, again, until the end of the world, that it's tempting to just say, well, sorry, we don't play that particular game. And the game we do play is we basically talk about everything. And we encourage you to talk about everything, and you will feel a lot better once you do. The other thing that's implicit in having a position of the sort we have sketched out here, where we think that moral truths exist and it's possible to be right and wrong, or more or less right and more or less wrong about what a good life is, that entails the claim that certain people and even whole cultures may not know what they're missing. You know, what I would want to claim here is that a religiously blinkered culture that feels no affinity for freedom of speech and thinks that cartoonists and novelists and other blasphemers should be killed for saying the wrong thing about the provenance of a certain book or about a certain historical figure. These people don't know what they're missing, and they don't realize how much of a price they're paying for this attitude toward freedom of thought and freedom of expression. And on some level, we know we're right about this. We know we're on the right side of history, and we have to encourage, cajole, browbeat, and ultimately even coerce people to get on the right side of history.
Yeah, I mean, again, I largely agree with what you say there, and I don't think that if somebody is trying to blackmail us into not saying something by deliberate threats and is using that as a tactic, um, I don't think we should yield to that. Although there might be a significant cost, but obviously, once that succeeds, then it's going to be a tactic which will be used over and over again. And freedom of thought and expression is something that is really important to defend. I certainly agree about that. Um, so it's really the rather different case that I was talking about, where it's not a deliberate tactic; it's just a reaction, and it's specifically about cartoons. It's not about expression of ideas. It's not about being able to criticize the religion. I certainly don't want to see any religion insulated from criticism, because I do think that there's a lot of harm that flows out of that. So if it gets to that point where people are saying, if you even dare to say that it's not the case that every word in the Quran is true and ought to be followed, clearly we're not going to play that game. We are going to be free to criticize uh, whatever religious texts people put up that we disagree with. That's a very important and fundamental freedom, and something that we should defend, even if there is some cost to doing so.
Yeah, well, I would just argue that the cartoons were of a piece with that larger consideration. In fact, they were even less of a criticism than the criticism that you would want to defend, which is, I mean, this is just the mere, in many cases, the mere depiction of the Prophet Muhammad, not even a critical one. I mean, there are people.
Exactly, but if it's just particularly that causes offense, then why,
Yeah,
and that causes a particularly violent kind of reaction, then why not leave the image out and stick to the arguments about uh, you know the nature of the sacred texts, or the nature of the doctrines, or how they came to be formulated, or why they're harmful to people, and point out that it doesn't look like God's particularly blessing people who are followers of Islam as compared to the rest of the world. Doesn't that make you think that maybe this is not somehow the only true religion? All of that sort of stuff.
right.
We can.
Yeah, no. Unfortunately, it's not the only thing that causes offense. I think we generally agree there. So now, if you picture our world becoming much better than it is in moral terms, what do you picture there? I mean, what are the most important ways our morality, is just speaking, globally, collectively, can improve, and just what does the world look like at that moment?
Well, the world takes much greater notice of suffering and misery wherever it's happening, and to uh, whoever it's happening to, or to, when I say whoever, I don't only mean human beings, I mean non-human animals as well. But if we are talking about human beings, whether they are close to us, whether they are, for example, fellow Americans, or whether they are people living in distant countries whom we will never meet, and we have the view that it's bad, that there should be avoidable suffering, and for that matter, avoidable premature death. So uh, I would see this as a world in which we use our resources more effectively than we are now, in order to assist people in extreme poverty, to help them to live better lives, to help them to have enough to eat, adequate health care, education for their children, um, and opportunities by hard work and diligence to get out of poverty. Because I think global poverty is one major source of avoidable misery. It would also be a world, as I was saying, in which we extend our concern to non-human animals. So we would not have a world in which, as we currently do, something like 65 billion animals are raised and killed for food each year. The vast majority of them living miserable lives, confined in factory farms, in intensive farms, uh, often crowded so they don't really have room to walk around. Um, and the whole system being, in any case, a net waste of food, causing net food loss because we have to feed these animals grain which we could otherwise eat directly ourselves. So, so I think it would be a world that avoided uh, those practices, the practices associated with producing animal foods for us to eat when we don't need to, a world in which we do much more for people in extreme poverty, and a world in which we look at other areas where people are suffering for no good reason. Another one of those, for example, that's been in the news quite a bit over the last few years is decisions at the end of life, to when people decide that their quality of life has fallen to a point where they no longer think it's worth going on with. Perhaps they're terminally ill, perhaps they're not
Mm.
terminally but incurably ill, um, and they say that's enough. I don't want to continue. Uh, Laws that prevent somebody helping them to die in a dignified and humane manner are, again, just laws that pointlessly prolong suffering. Nobody benefits from it. In fact, the rest of us, it typically harms because we're spending resources on the healthcare of people who don't want to go on living anyway. But the major reason for changing the law, of course, is because it's the people themselves who don't want it. They're the victims of it. So in a world that was morally better, we would be looking for these areas of life where we can effectively reduce the amount of suffering in the world.
Mm.
And once we'd found all of those areas, then I think we would also be looking at areas where we can increase happiness and joy in the world, where we can uh, give people lives that they enjoy more. So essentially, that's how I would see moral progress, as reducing avoidable misery and suffering, and where possible, making people happier, more fulfilled, more satisfied with the life they're living.
Is this phrase expanding the circle of our moral concern, does that originate with you?
It doesn't originate with me. I took it from a uh, a writer called W.E.H. Lecky, who wrote in I think the first decade of the 20th century, so around 1900 to 1910,
Mm.
something like that. And he wrote a wonderful book, which, if you haven't read it, I really recommend, called A History of European Morals. I think the full title is A History of European Morals from I'm not sure exactly, from Augustus to so basically, it mostly focuses on the uh, the Roman Empire, or the early Christian era,
Mm.
and it has fascinating discussions about morality at that time, about the early Christian morality of the people who went to the desert and stood on poles and
Yeah.
starved themselves and let lice grow on them and whipped themselves, and all of this, completely bizarre kind of idea that this was somehow a good thing to do. Uh, but he also does talk, for example, about enlightenment, more enlightened treatment of animals, and he talks about expanding the circle of morality to others, to first from the tribe to the larger society to the nation state,
Mm.
and so on. And so I took it from him and I popularized it, I suppose, in my own book, The Expanding Circle. But yeah, I think that is part of moral progress. And if people say, well, how far should it expand? I say it should include every sentient being. So it should include every being capable of feeling pain, capable of feeling that their life is going better or worse from their own subjective point of view. And of course, that includes many non-human animals of various species, maybe not everything that is zoologically an animal, but
Mm.
a great deal of them. It would include aliens if we find that there is sentient beings elsewhere in the universe. It would also include computers or robots if they became sufficiently developed to convince us that they were conscious beings who had a subjective perspective on their lives.
Yeah, well, I want to touch on all those specific topics, but let's stick with the basic concept of expanding the circle. What you run into there, it seems of necessity, are all of the political impediments to doing that. I mean, you can there are sort of two levels on which we can improve morally, that each of us can become moral philosophers or better moral philosophers personally, and we can fine tune our ethical code and treat people better and decide what to eat or not to eat so as to produce less misery. But the big swings in human flourishing would be when we make these changes at the level of public policy and the tax code and what nation states decide to do and not do and the kinds of wars we fight or don't fight. And that brings in politics. And, politics, for obvious reasons, are on everybody's mind at this moment. You and I are now talking on the day that there's going to be the third presidential debate between Trump and Clinton. Do you have any thoughts about what really appears to be a kind of crisis of confidence in our current political institutions and just an abysmal lowering of the standards of political discourse? What would a successful system look like, and how do you view our moment politically?
Uh, you're right. Just at the moment in the United States, it's not a good political moment. But although there are many negative things that one can say about where we are politically and about the short-sightedness and the self-interest that comes through in politics, I think that there are, if you look at it over a longer-term trend, I think that gives you room for some sort of hope anyway, for less despondency than you might otherwise have if you just look at the immediate goings on. Because I think the effect of policies largely has been to improve the way things are in the world. Ironically, one of the things on which both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders agreed was that America's trade policy should be aimed at benefiting Americans. And I think that that's not right. I mean, one can easily understand why politicians facing American voters may say that. But surely in designing our trade policies, we should at least give some weight to the impact on the 7.3 billion people in the world who are not Americans, as compared to the 300 million or so who are. And in fact, the opening up of trade, particularly, I guess, in terms of trade with China and other parts of East Asia, but also with Mexico and other countries, has actually significantly benefited many poor people in the world. So we have seen since the 1980s a quite significant decline in not only the absolute number of people in extreme poverty, but also the proportion of the world's population who are in extreme poverty. And that's surely a good thing. So I'm hopeful that despite the objections that have come from both Trump and Sanders, that America's trade policies will continue to look outward in various ways and will make it easier for people elsewhere in the world who are extremely poor to get work that can provide them with enough to feed their families on. That seems to be a good thing. And there are various other policies on which I see signs of progress. On the case of animals we were talking about before, they don't really get mentioned in elections much, but not in the United States anyway. But through lobbying of corporations by organizations like the Humane Society of the United States and the Humane League and Mercy for Animals and a variety of other groups, one after another, these corporations have agreed to phase out their use of animal products from the most cruel forms of confinement. So from the battery cage in which hens can't even spread their wings, from the individual stalls or crates in which breeding sows can't turn around, can't even walk a step or two. Many corporations, McDonald's, Walmart's, major supermarket chains like Kroger's and Albertsons, have said that they will phase out the purchase of products from these systems. So we're making progress in other ways there, even if not through the political process. And of course, the other area we talked about, physician assistance in dying, is something which California recently voted to have legislation permitting, and that legislation is now in force. So that's another good step forward, and we've seen a similar step in Canada. So I think there are lots of opportunities to make progress,
Mm.
and despite all the demagoguery and the absurdly low level of the political debate that we've had for this election, I'm not really uh, I'm not really hostile, or I should say, I'm not really um, disappointed in the longer term progress that we have been making. I think it gives us occasion to hope that we are making moral progress in general in the long term.
It almost seems despite ourselves.
Well, just despite some elements of institutions, I would say, not necessarily despite ourselves.
The thing that worries me, and this election is really the crystallization of it, but it's been worrying me and I think many people for some time, is that there's the assumption that more information and more access to it would be, really this kind of cuts against what I was just saying about free speech in a way. The assumption that simply more talk would almost by definition lead to an increased ability to persuade people of things that are clearly true or untrue, or, against believing things that are untrue. That assumption is showing signs of being disconfirmed. I mean, just that when you look at people's lives on the internet and the way in which they can just disappear for months and years into an echo chamber where their worldview becomes more or less hermetically sealed from any kind of intrusion of facts from the outside. I mean, it's just paradoxical that we're living at a moment where it's easier than it has ever been to disconfirm an untruth or to show the evidence of needless human misery being created somewhere. And yet, the difficulty we're seeing in persuading people across ideological lines, it's seeming more and more intractable. I mean, so to take one example, because I'm very often on the front lines of controversy, and as I know you've been in a slightly different mode, but, I hear from people who believe things that, I mean, these are otherwise apparently sane and even intelligent people who believe things that just on their face should be so impossible to believe, but there's a culture now of conspiracy thinking that is, ramified by the occasional conspiracy that is brought to light, obviously, but it seems completely unconstrained by any sane principles of thinking. And so I'll hear from someone who will think, in the aftermath of the Newtown shooting, for instance, that was a hoax, that there were no children killed there. That was just a hoax concocted by the Obama administration to justify taking our guns, right? So, I mean, there are people who have these conversations in deadly earnest online, and they even get in touch with me insisting that I have this wrong, or the 9/11 truth conspiracy, or, I mean, there's many of these things and many of these ideas, but credible ideas that we do want to be able to talk about, particularly in, I mean, like the issue of the problem of political Islam, that is a real problem that we have to talk about. But if you make a slightly lateral move in that conversation, you find yourself in the company of people who see conspiracies everywhere. And it's becoming very difficult to debunk these conspiracies, or there's no debunking that is ever satisfying to someone who holds these views. And I don't know, I mean, maybe the world was always this way and it's just becoming impossible to ignore now, but it is disconcerting.
I mean, I do think the world was always this way, and you've talked about particular conspiracies and particular people who are hermetically sealed in an internet bubble. But if you think of Europe just a couple of centuries ago, then there were rural villages who were hermetically sealed in a Roman Catholic bubble,
Hmm.
and they believe things that I think are just as incredible as the idea that the shooting at the Sandy Hook shooting was a hoax. I mean, the various ideas about let's say, I don't know, the Virgin Mary ascending bodily to heaven, or there's a whole host of these ideas of miracle cures, of all of the kinds of things that were widely believed in Europe a couple of centuries ago, and I'm sure a lot of people never really got them to be questioned until, say, the 18th century, maybe, when some different ideas started around, but then in more isolated rural areas, not even then, and perhaps still today, some of these things are quite difficult to question. So um, I'm not convinced that this is worse. The internet makes it different, and there's particular new twists and new ideas that people have, but fortunately, it's a relatively small number of people who believe these bizarre conspiracies. You may see more of them than I do because of the circles that you move in, and
Mm.
because of your, people think, I guess, that if you're critical of militant Islam, then you're going to be sympathetic to some of these other ideas as well that don't really have much connection with it. But I think if you look at the larger picture, actually, there's probably more people who are thinking rationally and open to evidence than there have been in previous times.
It's easy to be hopeful when you roll back the clock a couple of centuries or even less and see how we were thinking and behaving. And I do follow someone like Steve Pinker largely on that point, that things are moving in the right direction. To focus perhaps disconcertingly on a narrow political question for a moment, but it connects to more general principles. What are your thoughts about Edward Snowden and what he did? I'm interested to know what you think about it, but also just how do you think about it? I understand you may not know what in fact is true there, but what would cause you to judge him to be a hero or a traitor or something in between?
Well, the term traitor isn't one that would come to mind for me because I don't think he betrayed the country. I think that he thought that he was acting according to the highest principles of the United States Constitution in terms of freedom of information, and the idea that you can't really have a democracy if the vote of the citizens are uninformed about important issues. So I certainly would reject the terminology of traitor.
Hmm.
Um, how I think about what he did, though, is again, unsurprisingly, going to depend on what I think about the consequences of what he did as compared to the consequences of any other options that might have been open to him. So one big consequence is that we know about the government's security programs, monitoring our communications, um, and the result of that has been some legislation restricting that monitoring. How effective that is going to be, I don't really know. I'm not capable of knowing. Um, On the other hand, it's claimed that not only is it decent voting US citizens who now know about this monitoring, but terrorists know about it as well. Terrorists may take steps to avoid being monitored because they know more about the program. And in addition, if the program is restricted, then the claim is that it becomes harder to discover further terrorist plots. Those are difficult claims to assess. I have talked to some people who know a lot more about the US intelligence than I do. At least one of them said that there was no good evidence that this intelligence had led to foiling any plots. But really, I don't know. I suppose, though, I would say that I think that what Snowden did was perhaps not sufficiently thought out in those terms.
Hmm.
That is, I'd like to know what information did he have about the likely impact of the program, and did he weigh that against simply the principle that the public ought to know about this?
Hmm.
Um, because I think that's how it should be weighed. Now, maybe after you weighed it, you would come out with the idea that the public knowing about this is more important than any benefits that had been obtained by it or that were likely to be obtained from it in future. But too often there is, as we were talking about before, in terms of moral rules and ideas about rights and principles, too often there's just this idea that, well, the public has a right to know, and therefore I'm going to release this information, and I don't care what the consequences of it would be. That's not the way in which I evaluate the decision.
So I ask because I'm looking for how you bring in the ethical significance of intentions, and you clearly do because it's the way you ruled out him being a traitor. Presumably, you accept his stated motives or something like his stated motives. Whereas if in his interviews he had said, I, wanted to destroy the United States and I thought this was the best way to do it, you would be more inclined to view him as a kind of a prototypical traitor. So intentions are doing some work that is distinguishable from the consequences in the world outside this person's mind. So let's just take two cases. Let's say that what Snowden did was, on balance, obviously good, and no one was harmed, and society will be better as a result. But he did it with the intention of destroying the United States and causing great harm, right? That's one case. The opposite case is obviously he intended to do good. He had every reason to think he was going to be doing good, but as luck would have it, he created immense harm by leaking this information. So those are two very different worlds and two very different Snowdens. How do you think about the role of intention in judging various actions to be good or bad?
Intention is critical in judging the agents. So what I think of Snowden would very heavily depend on his intentions. Although in the case where he intended to do good, but it worked out terribly, I might want to know, well, okay, so his intentions were good, but how careful was he to find out what the likely consequences of his actions were? Uh, so negligence is not exactly intention, but it's certainly culpable.
Mm.
So that's one question. What do we think of Snowden himself? And intentions are very relevant. What do we think of the act? Did what he did, the release of the information, was that the right thing to do? That doesn't depend on his intentions. That depends, in my view, on the consequences of the release of the information.
But still, if his intentions are bad, he's bad. I mean, so you,
Yeah,
you view just a clear line of separation between the person himself and whatever consequences there are in the world.
that's right. That's how I would view it.
When people argue for consequentialism, they often discount intentions. Like they basically they just want to know about body count. So if more people died, I mean, this really comes up when we talk about collateral damage in time of war. And this is actually a topic I want to move to, so maybe we can keep talking about the role of intention in this context. Let's just ask the more basic question first. How do you view violence and the ethics of violence? When is violence morally justifiable in your view?
I'm not a pacifist, so I think that violence can be justifiable when the consequences of not using violence are significantly worse than using it. Um, so uh, the general idea of defensive war is normally justifiable because if you're not ready to go to war in defense, then aggressors are simply going to be able to walk over you, and that's not going to be a better world. So that would be one case in which I think the use of violence is normally justifiable. I mean, not always. I guess I can imagine cases where actually allowing the aggressor to take over your country is better for the inhabitants of the country than waging war. Because if you wage war, let's say everybody will get killed.
Hmm.
So uh, there's a normally sort of qualifier in that. I also think that nations with strong military forces have a responsibility to protect people everywhere in the world against genocide and against large-scale crimes against humanity. So I support the idea, which has now been accepted by the United Nations, that there is a responsibility to protect people. That responsibility normally would fall on the government of each and every country. But if that government either fails to prevent genocide or crimes against humanity, or if it itself is causing genocide or crimes against humanity, then I think there is a justified case for intervention, even, including military intervention, obviously, which involves the use of violence. I'd like to see that authorized by the United Nations. I think that the idea of one nation taking its own actions in order to decide when something is a sufficiently serious crime against humanity, for example, or when something is a case of genocide to intervene. I think that has dangerous precedents because countries will intervene where it's in their own political interests, where it's part of realpolitik to intervene, as well as where there's some pretext that they're intervening to prevent genocide or crimes against humanity. So I'd like to see this. I'd like to see generally this happen as a result of a vote in the United Nations somewhere. Under the present system, it would have to be in the Security Council, but perhaps eventually there'll be different mechanisms by which this can take place.
So, do you share my view of pacifism here? Because pacifism has this reputation for being not only somewhere on the moral high ground, but if you can hold the view, really just imagined to be this impregnable moral position of virtue, probably as a result of Gandhi's reputation. But when you look at the realities of our world and the kinds of antagonists we have faced in the past and could face in the future, pacifism, in my view, especially when you have an alternative, seems just a starkly immoral position. It seems to be just a willingness to let the most sadistic and evil people on earth do anything they want, whenever they want. And even if you had the power to stop it, you are more committed to not getting your hands dirty. How do you think about pacifism?
Yeah, I think what you said is pretty much right. I don't think it's a position that has the high moral ground. I mean, you could see it in some way as a noble position when people are prepared to not respond to violence in the way that Gandhi did, as you mentioned, or Martin Luther King. We can see that as vastly better than trying to resist force with force, especially if you know that you're going to be overwhelmed, as of course Gandhi would have been, and as more militant African American movements were, to the extent that they existed. So, in that sense, being prepared to take the truncheon blows of the racist cops or of the British or whatever, and not resist shows a certain moral courage. And in those particular circumstances, of course, it was actually effective. But that's because the powers that be in those cases, the British in India and white US, did restrain themselves to some extent.
Yeah.
If they had been like the Nazis, that would have been the end of Gandhi. That would have been the end of Martin Luther King. They would have disappeared into concentration camps, obviously, and not emerged. So that will work in some circumstances, and in those circumstances, I'm all in favor of it. Good. It's a good way of bringing about change. But to regard it as a universally applicable philosophy that can deal with all threats of aggression, no matter from whom they come, seems to me to be hopelessly naive.
And Gandhi is rumored to have recommended that the Jews walk willingly into the gas chambers so as to arouse the world to the enormity of Hitler's crimes. I say rumored. I have this from something Orwell wrote about Gandhi. I don't believe I've seen that confirmed anywhere else.
No, I've never heard of that as a Gandhi quote, I must say.
Obviously, the contradiction there, whether or not Gandhi said it, it's obviously it's possible to believe such a thing, but you then have to ask, what should the world do once aroused? If you have a world filled with pacifists of the Gandhian sort, well, then we would be living in the thousand-year Reich. This issue about violence and state violence is interesting to me because when I think about expanding the circle of moral concern and becoming more and more sensitized to the problem of collateral damage in time of war, as we are, and I think we would both feel that that's almost an intrinsic good to want to reduce collateral suffering and death as much as possible when using violence. But there's an asymmetry here that becomes troubling because when you think about certain kinds of enemies who have not expanded their circle, right? That gives them a kind of leverage that we don't have, or at least we're in the process of losing. And so there are many asymmetries here that I think about. You just think about the use of human shields. You have those who use human shields, and then you have those who are deterred by their use to one or another
Mhm.
degree. So, I mean, one side is making this extraordinarily callous and cynical use of the other side's greater moral concern for human life, and it's actually effective. And if you imagine reversing things, it's ridiculous. So if you imagine the Americans or the Israelis using American or Israeli non-combatants as human shields to deter jihadists, well, then that becomes like some grotesque Monty Python sketch, right? I mean, it wouldn't
Right.
work, and it would be laughable. I mean, you would just see hilarity on the side of the jihadists, and or you consider the prisoner swaps between Palestinians and Israelis, where the Palestinians can demand 1,000 of their prisoners in exchange for one Israeli captive. Now, perhaps there's another way of viewing this, but it seems on its face to reveal a three order of magnitude difference in how the Palestinians and Israelis value a human life, or one of their own human lives. And I mean, there's endless examples from this sort of conflict. So, the Al Qaeda training manual recommended to their followers that, if you get imprisoned, your infidel jailers will be too squeamish to torture you. And there's so much moral condemnation of torture on their side because they're such an effete society that you need only complain that you were tortured to the Red Cross, and you'll just throw these people into fits. So just if you get arrested, just complain you were tortured, and they'll start attacking themselves over your case. And so the problem that I see is that when your enemy has no scruples, your own scruples become another weapon in his hand. And I wonder whether there are certain possible conflicts that we are becoming less and less equipped to fight because of the moral progress we've made. And I just wonder how you think about that.
That's certainly a possibility. Yes, I mean, there may be cases where the enemy is so willing to commit atrocities and so threatening to us that we have to do things that we would rather not do. So you mentioned the case of human shields, for example. So if uh, somebody has taken humans hostage and is using them as shields and is likely, under the cover of those human shields, to let off a bomb, let's say, in a populated area that will kill far more people than the number of human shields who have been taken. And the only way we can stop that bomb going off is by being prepared to shoot through the human shields, in other words, killing the human shields. Then that's what we should do.
Mm.
We should do so very reluctantly, of course, as a last resort. We ought to feel repugnance at the thought of killing innocent people who are shields, but we do have to look at the larger consequences of not acting, and there certainly could be such cases. I'm not sure whether there have been. Can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but it's quite possible that there are such cases, and this is going to be the problem with dealing with completely unscrupulous enemies in an age in which they can easily get weapons and they can easily reach places that in a previous age they might not have been able to reach.
Do you think World War II would have been such a case? I mean, could we have fought World War II with our current ethics and won? And I'm thinking in particular of things like, and I'm not a military historian, so I'm unaware of the strategic or tactical necessity of everything we did there. But when you think of actions like the endless bombing of cities like Dresden and Tokyo, or obviously our use of nuclear weapons, Hiroshima being probably the only defensible one, if it is defensible. Do you think that we could have won World War II with the current tuning of our ethics?
I do think we could have beaten Nazi Germany. Yes, my reading of the military history of the Allied bombing of German cities is that it was not particularly effective in military terms. Yes, obviously it caused some damage to transport and to manufacturing, but it didn't have a major impact on the end of the war, and to some extent, of course, bombing civilians um, makes the civilian morale more determined to resist the aggressor than not doing that. So the idea that you were going to break German morale by bombing the cities, which I think was the rationale that was discussed in Churchill's cabinet at the time, seems not to have been the case. The,
Mm.
the, the more interesting example, and it doesn't really relate to your question, which was about winning the Second World War, because I think we could also have, in the end, defeated Japan without uh, either the bombing of cities such as Tokyo or the use of nuclear weapons. But I think the cost, most of the people who've looked at this suggest that the cost of using only conventional weapons to defeat Japan, which would have involved an invasion of the Japanese islands and, of course, the accompanying bombing of a huge number of military targets that would no doubt have caused a lot of civilian deaths as well as so-called
Mm.
collateral damage, foreseeable side effects of the bombing of military targets, plus the cost in American lives, of course, of the soldiers, that would have been far higher than the total cost of the bombs on Hiroshima and even on Nagasaki, which, as your remarks, I think, indicated, is more difficult to defend than the bomb on Hiroshima,
Mm.
because quite possibly the Japanese would have surrendered in a few more days, even without the bomb on Nagasaki.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting argument. If you assume that contemporary views about the morality of war would have prevented us dropping the bomb on Hiroshima, and let's assume as a result of that, over the next year or so, there would have been an invasion of the Japanese home islands, and let's say that the casualties would have been, well, just say 5 times as great as the casualties of even both bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So what should we think about that if that is the case? Should we think that that would justify the dropping of the bombs? A lot of people would say no, because they would say this was terror bombing. This was the deliberate targeting of civilians, using people as a means to an end, the end being, of course, to persuade the Japanese government to surrender, and the means being the death of the innocent victims of those bombs. But
Mm.
but if we assume that the casualties would have been 5 times higher, and we assume also that this would have included both combatants and non-combatants, I don't draw a really huge distinction there, I guess, in this case. But let's just, for the sake of making it easier, assume that there would have been 5 times as many civilians killed too. Then I think the dropping of the bomb was justified. Now you might say there was something else altogether that could have been done. There's been discussions that the Japanese government could have been invited to witness a testing of the bomb with all the destruction that showed. I, again, don't know whether that was feasible, whether that would have ever convinced the Japanese to surrender. So, but for the sake of the argument, assume that there was no option. It was either dropping the bomb or it was the invasion by conventional forces with much higher civilian as well as military casualties.
Mm.
Then I think dropping the bomb was the right thing to do.
The possible objection there is that dropping a bomb intentionally on non-combatants, that there are more ethereal costs that need to be put on the balance of consequences, that it's not just that body count. This is what I often run into in talking about consequentialism. I think body count is rather often an insufficient measure of the complete consequences of doing one thing or another. And the sense that consequentialism isn't a good enough moral theory is usually the result of consequentialists not looking clearly at all of the possible or likely consequences that are, again, quite a bit more ethereal, but nonetheless real than body count. So to come to the classic example of you're in your doctor's waiting room, he knows he has 5 patients all of whom need a organ transplant. You're just there for a checkup and are reasonably healthy. So he decides to anesthetize you and steal your organs and kill you, and a very ugly version of the trolley problem. Most people, or many people who reject consequentialism, say, well, there's no place to stand as a consequentialist to resist the slide into that kind of world because, look, you're saving lives. You know, you lost one and you saved five, so you saved a net four lives. But it's pretty obvious that none of us want to live in a world where at any moment you could be killed by your doctor once he's calculated that he can use your organs to better purpose. And so there are costs, there are consequences to the fear and the paranoia and the experience of having this done to your kids and all the rest that we don't want to absorb. And it's just that they're not as clear cut as body count.
Yeah, you're right. There are certainly other consequences that need to be taken into consideration. In the case of the Hiroshima bomb, and I should say it's easy to say this in hindsight. I'm not sure that the larger consequences have been bad.
Hmm.
After all, there is the really important fact that after the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, no more nuclear bombs have been dropped in anger, been dropped on civilians or military targets for that matter. Over this period of what is it now? It's 70, 75 years,
Yeah.
something like that. Did I 70 years? 70 years, I guess. So that's a really good thing. And it's quite possible that the fact that the bomb was dropped, at least one of them was dropped, and people could see how devastating it was, how terrible it was, how the radiation illness lingered and the damage. Maybe that's the reason why there have been no further bombs dropped. So it's possible otherwise that this weapon would have been used in some other conflicts that we've had. And it's difficult to say.
So what do you do with that? It seems that the tally of consequences is on some level always open-ended, which is to say that there's nothing that is so bad on its face that it might not have a silver lining, right? So now we're talking about the silver lining in the mushroom cloud of Hiroshima. As you say, there may have been all of these benefits for having horrified ourselves and the world by actually using nuclear weapons. We're much better stewards of nuclear weaponry now. The Cold War remained cold. Who knows what would have happened if we hadn't seen the horrors of Hiroshima? What do you do with the fact, and again, this is a fairly common objection to consequentialism, that the votes are never finally and fully in, it seems. What do you do with that?
Yeah, obviously, you just have to predict as well as you possibly can the consequences. And as the consequences get further and further out, and they become quite uncertain, and you could speculate that there'll be good consequences, and you can speculate that there'll be bad consequences. You just have to say the probabilities are so uncertain here that we should not take account. There's nothing to take account of there. We have to go with the consequences in the nearer future that we can predict. So I think, in fact, what I was saying about the possible good consequences of the Hiroshima bomb in terms of deterring further use of nuclear weapons was really by way of canceling out
Hmm.
what you had said about
Right.
the possible bad consequences of it in terms of the, if you like, the greater acceptability of terror bombing or the views that what it says about our attitudes to innocent human beings and so on. And in that sense, I think was reasonable to say, we don't know what those consequences are going to be. Let's look at what the toll is likely to be from the bomb, and let's also look at what the toll is likely to be from an invasion, from any other means that we have of defeating Japan. And if the toll from the bomb is lower than that of any other means of defeating Japan, then perhaps it's reasonable to go ahead. Now let me say that I'm not saying that this is actually historically what happened,
Yeah.
because clearly, historically, what happened, and I think pretty much always does happen in war, is that the fact that these were Japanese civilians meant that their lives counted rather little. The fact that a number of the lives lost, a substantial number probably, through an invasion of the Japanese islands would have been American lives, that counted for a great deal.
Right.
And so very likely there wasn't any such calculation made of the total death toll in which all of these lives are given equal weight. But ideally, and this may seem utopian given the passions that war arouses, ideally that would be the kind of calculation you would make.
As we're getting close to our 2-hour mark, I realized we had only scheduled 2 hours for this call, and it seems like 2 weeks might be insufficient to cover all these topics of interest. I want to ask you just quickly about various moral principles. Is there an important moral distinction between acts of omission and acts of commission? I mean, we certainly act as though there were. So, how does and your famous shallow pond example put some pressure on this here. So, how do you think about the difference between not saving a life that would be very easy for you to save and taking one actively? And this obviously also relates to end of life considerations of the sort you mentioned, the difference we seem to hold on to between removing life support and passively letting someone die versus actively killing them, which in many cases might be the more merciful thing to do.
Yes. So my view is that the distinction between killing and letting die, or between acts and omissions, it's put in different ways, um, is not itself of great intrinsic significance. It may be a marker for other things of more significance, like it may be a marker for motives, for instance. So if somebody would say to me, suppose I say, look, you should give to this effective charity. Let's be specific. You should give to the Against Malaria Foundation because it will distribute bed nets in places where there's a lot of malaria and where children die from malaria. And if you donate what I know you can afford to donate to the Against Malaria Foundation, they will use it to distribute bed nets, and you will be saving at least one child's life. And that's factual. I think that is a real organization and a real
Mm.
example. And let's say the person doesn't do that, right? So then that person has, in one sense, let a child die. Do I think of that person exactly the same as somebody who traveled to Africa, shot a small child, and then traveled back to the United States? Of course not. I know that there's a huge psychological difference in that person, that many of us are apathetic or don't care enough, don't feel psychologically drawn to help people who we can't even see. But for someone to actually have the malice and the will to travel, to find a child, to kill that child, it has to be a completely horrible, depraved person.
Mm.
So sometimes the distinction between acts and omissions will signal something like that. Why did this person go out of their way to kill? Whereas in the other case, they simply didn't do enough to save a life. But then let's look at another case, the medical case that you mentioned. So an infant has been born prematurely and has had a very severe bleeding in the brain, a hemorrhage. The doctors do a scan of the brain. They find that all of the parts of the brain that are associated with consciousness, like the cortex, have been irreversibly destroyed. Now, there's two possible things that might happen in these circumstances. One might be that the doctors, after discussion with the parents, say, look, your child really has a hopeless future. They'll survive if we continue to treat them, but they'll just lie in bed all day and never be able to communicate with anyone, probably never have any conscious experiences at all, have to be fed through a tube and so on. And the doctors will then say, and the parents will usually agree, so we could withdraw the respirator. Your baby is too small to breathe on his own. We can withdraw the respirator and your baby will die. And parents will typically say, if you think that's best, doctor, then I'm okay with that. And the baby will die. Now, that is seen as a letting die, as an allowing to die, not as a killing. On the other hand, it might have happened that because it took some time to carry out the diagnosis, because the baby was particularly vigorous and so on, that the baby no longer needs a respirator. So the prognosis is exactly the same. The baby is never going to communicate in any way, probably never going to be conscious. He's going to have to be fed through a tube and lie on a bed.
Mm.
But you can't bring about the baby's death by withdrawing the respirator. And let's just say that there's nothing else you can do that will bring about the baby's death. The baby is otherwise, apart from this massive and irreparable brain damage, the baby is otherwise healthy. Now, I think that if you're prepared to say that it was justifiable to withdraw the respirator, you ought to be prepared to say it would be justifiable to give the baby a lethal injection so that the baby dies without suffering. There is no moral difference. In both cases, you know exactly what the consequences of your action will be. In both cases, your intention is to bring about the death of the child. Your motivation is equally, I would say, equally good, equally reasonable in both cases. So the means is really irrelevant. But legally, of course, one is murder and the other is, well, maybe it's slightly grey in some countries, but anyway, it's done in every neonatal intensive care unit in every major city in the United States,
Right.
and nobody ever gets prosecuted for it. So it seems to be legally acceptable. But that's, as I say, that's a case where I would think we ought to be able to accept active steps on the basis of saying it's no different from the other case.
And then certainly there are cases where the active step is the one that bypasses an immense amount of suffering, right? Where the passive one may.
Absolutely. That's right. In other cases where there is some consciousness, not exactly the case I described, but where
Right.
there is some consciousness, I do know of cases where people will say, no, we can't actually take active steps to end life, but if the baby gets pneumonia, we won't give antibiotics. And so then the baby will suffer a lingering death from pneumonia
Right.
over days or maybe even a couple of weeks. Which is a horrible thing and a pointless thing to do if you decided that it's better that the baby should die. Why let the baby suffer in this way?
I want to go back to the issue of the shallow pond, and I know our listeners are familiar with this argument because I spoke about it with Will McCaskill. So you admit that there's a difference. It would take a very different sort of person to go to Africa with the intention of killing someone than merely decline to buy a bed net when told on good information that this would save a human life. Those are very different people, but I think you're saying that it's natural for us to view them as different, and because it requires actually a different psychology to do one versus the other, they are different. But if we abstract away from those differences and talk about public policies and what governments should do, then the act and omission difference shouldn't be morally salient to us anymore. Is that where you're headed with that?
I'm not going to say that it shouldn't be at all morally salient because there are questions in what governments do in terms of the examples that they set. But I do think it's very serious that governments allow people to die when they could prevent them, when they have the resources to prevent them.
Hmm.
So I certainly think that the governments of the wealthier nations of the world should be getting together and developing policies to eliminate preventable child deaths and preventable suffering from diseases. They did make a reasonable effort in terms of the Millennium Development Goals to reduce suffering, and progress was made. The number of children dying fell quite significantly during that period, as did the number of people in extreme poverty. And that's a good thing. But I'm concerned whether sufficient progress is continuing to be made. I think more progress could have been made even in that period, although some progress was made. And I think we should be doing more. And that applies to governments, but it also applies to individuals. I think all of us who can afford to donate to effective charities ought to be doing that because the governments are not doing enough.
How do you view the ethical significance of proximity, if there is any? I mean, obviously, there's an immense psychological significance that the starving person on my doorstep is different, certainly more salient than the starving person in a distant country whose existence I know about, at least in the abstract. Presumably, you think that that difference is far bigger than it should be, but is there any ethical significance to proximity? The problem in your backyard as opposed to the problem an ocean away?
Um, well, I'd say not to proximity in itself again. We can perhaps be more confident about what we're achieving when things are in our backyard and we actually can see what's happening. We can talk to the people who are affected by it. But we do have very good research now about effective nonprofit organizations that are trying to help people far away. Um, so There's organizations like GiveWell that do
Mm.
research on effective charities. There's an organization I founded called The Life You Can Save, and it has a website which lists charities that we've vetted, and some of it draws on GiveWell's research, some of it draws on other research, so that we recommend effective charities. And if you can have a high level of confidence in the effectiveness of what you're doing, then it's not very different morally. As you correctly said, it is very different psychologically, but morally, it's not very different from things that are going on in your backyard.
Given that it is so different psychologically, I mean, presumably if I told you that there's a starving person by my front door today that I just stepped over on the way to this podcast because I was, I'm busy, you would view me with something close to horror and repugnance and would be right to. But if I told you that I got yet another appeal from a good charity, which I didn't act on, you would just view me as a more or less psychologically normal, if somewhat aloof person. Do you view our moral progress personally and collectively as a matter of collapsing that distance as much as psychologically possible so that we really can't put distant suffering out of sight and out of mind?
Yes, I do think that's an indicator of progress. And it's, the psychology is understandable, of course. Our ancestors for millennia, for perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, if we go back even, could go back even to social primates before there were humans at all. Um, these ancestors lived in small social groups, face to face groups, where they knew people and they would help others and cooperate with them in various ways. But they had no relations, perhaps even to people who lived across the mountain range in the next valley. Uh, and now, suddenly, in terms of evolutionary time anyway, we live in a world where we have instant communications, where we have very rapid delivery of assistance, where we have good ways of working out what is going to help people most effectively. And our psychology has not changed rapidly enough to cope with this. So that's why the psychology is as you described it. But we should be thinking about this issue. We should be becoming more aware of it, and we should be again using our abilities to think and to reflect and to reason to recognize that distance isn't really ethically relevant, and that sometimes, in fact, quite often, we can be much more cost effective in helping people in developing countries. I mean, think of it this way: the World Bank poverty line is $1.90 per day, so let's say roughly $700 a year. The US poverty line for an individual is over $11,000 per year. So suppose you've got $1,000 to spare that you could donate to somebody. To whose life are you going to make a bigger difference?
Mm.
Getting somebody in the US to go from 11,000 to 12,000, or getting someone somewhere else to go from 700 to 1,700? I think the answer to that is quite obvious, and that does reflect a difference in cost effectiveness, whether it's money we're giving or whether it's anti-malaria nets or whether it's uh, training in how to be more productive in your farming practices or whatever it might be.
Well, I realize we're coming up against our hard stop in time. I want to ask maybe two more quick questions here and apologize to many of our listeners for not getting to many of the topics they would want us to have touched. I know the vegans and vegetarians are going to be outraged that we haven't spent any significant time on non-human animals, but I think our views on those topics are pretty well understood. But I want to ask you one question in that area. What if certain animal lives, let's say the life of a happy cow, are net positive lives, which is to say it's better to have existed than to not have existed as a happy cow? And if we had an appropriate regime of raising cows for slaughter, we would be producing some billions of happy cows, or cows that are happier than certainly anything that's in our factory farming system, and happier than, let's say, most wild animals. So it's happy as a cow can be, and it wouldn't exist but for our practice of raising it for slaughter, how would you view the ethics of eating those cows?
You can, it's possible to defend from an animal welfare point of view a situation like that in which the cow is having a really good life, the slaughter is humane, and so on. But I think in practice, it's. I'm not saying that there are no situations like that, but it's actually quite difficult, and there are other factors as well that need to be taken into account. So you mentioned a cow. I don't know if this is therefore an assumption that this is a dairy cow rather than an animal being raised for beef,
Mm.
but cows only give milk if they are made pregnant at regular intervals, roughly each year, and if their calf is then taken away from them so that the milk can be used by humans, and the calf will often be slaughtered very young for veal. If it's a male, if it's a female, she may be reared for to join the dairy herd. So, but the separation of the cow and her calf causes suffering. I think everybody who's observed this will see that cows bellow for their calves. The calves look for their mothers. So, in the dairy industry, it's actually pretty difficult to have these kinds of circumstances and still have a commercial operation that produces milk for humans.
Mm.
It might be more feasible in the beef industry, but the other factor that ought to be taken into account here is, and this is particularly true of cattle and other ruminant animals, is there's a significant greenhouse gas component to ruminants. They
Hmm.
produce methane, and the fact that they're out on grass doesn't help that at all. In fact, it makes it even worse than if they were in a feedlot eating grain, because they have to digest more grass to put on the number of pounds of beef that they will eventually put on before being sent to market. So the longer period of digestion leads to more methane being produced. So that's I think, a serious obstacle to thinking of ethical meat consumption, not just based on the animal welfare perspective, which in some circumstances you might be able to satisfy, but based on the overall picture of what we're doing to the planet.
Has anyone published a reasonably complete taxonomy of animal suffering where you could sort of rank order the wrongs you commit by participating in various practices, eating chicken versus fish versus cow, dairy versus beef consumption, etc.?
I'm not sure about an actual ranking or attempt to quantify. I've in fact got a student at Princeton who's trying to compare, how much chicken suffering goes on, and how do you compare that with suffering of humans, for example. It's a very difficult task, and it's interesting that he's even attempting that.
Hmm.
Um, in the book, The Ethics of What We Eat, that I wrote with Jim Mason, we do describe various forms of animal production, and I suppose it would be possible from those descriptions to get some sort of implied ranking. And there may be something that animal charity evaluators have done. Animal charity evaluators is a kind of give well of the animal advocacy uh, organization. So it researches and ranks the top-rated, most effective animal charity. So that's worth looking at, and there's extensive blogs, and maybe someone has tried to do this in some of those blogs. My own view would be that clearly it's the intensive factory farming that is the worst. So when people say, "Oh, I've stopped eating red meat. I'm only eat chicken now,"
Hmm.
I think their diet has got worse. I think there's a lot more chickens that they have to eat. I had an article on this with Karen Dawn, a friend in the Los Angeles Times, just last Sunday.
Right.
In
I
fact,
saw that. Yeah.
right. So you're responsible for a lot more suffering, a lot more chickens, and chickens are virtually all factory farmed, and the conditions are quite horrible. I won't go into it now, but
You would admit that there's got to be a hierarchy of moral concern based on the actual or possible experience of these animals. So, for instance, if it's just a fact that pigs suffer much more than cows, then we do more wrong in mistreating and killing and otherwise immiserating pigs than cows based on the actual facts of their experience, right? It's got to be anchored to,
Certainly,
yeah,
certainly. Yeah. If there is a fact about that, and if we can know that fact, then we ought to focus on the animals. Well, we ought to focus on the animals who can suffer most, and regard that as a higher priority.
yeah. Okay, sorry to keep you past your hour here, but one more quick question
Yeah.
that just has to be a capsule to your views on this subject. But how do you think about future generations and our ethical responsibility toward beings or people that don't exist? Why would it be a bad thing if we all died in our sleep tonight and painlessly, and future generations were uncreated?
So I do think that there is value in human life when it's lived at a high quality, and I'm optimistic enough to think that we will in the future solve some of the serious problems that face us now, and that we will continue to make progress in terms of reducing suffering, reducing unnecessary violence, and giving people a better life. So the loss there would be the loss of all future generations, at least in this corner of the universe, um, and of their happiness and of the fulfillment of their lives. And we were talking right at the beginning of this conversation about objective values.
Hmm.
I think there would be a loss of objective value in that sense. The universe would be a worse place, to the extent of those lives not being lived.
Yet another thing we agree about. Well,
Oh,
listen,
good.
Peter, you've been extremely generous with your time, and it's really been great to talk to you. And just finally, tell people where they can find you online, on your Twitter address, or anything else you would like to be publicly available.
Sure. Yes, I do tweet as Peter Singer. You should be able to find me on Twitter. I also have a website, and the website is petersinger.info. You can find things about me there. Uh, Please do look at the organization that I founded, thelifeyoucansave.org, in terms of looking for effective charities to which you might give. And I also recommend, if you're interested in animal issues, look at animalcharityevaluators.org, and support the organizations that they're recommending. I'm not saying that the organizations that they're not recommending are not good. Some of them are, but I do think you can be confident that the ones they are recommending certainly are good.
I'll have all those links on my blog where this podcast will be embedded. So,
Terrific. Thank you.
again, thank you, Peter, and I hope our paths cross again soon.
I certainly hope so. Thanks very much, Sam. It's been great talking with you.